morning, everyone. Oh, good afternoon, yes. My name is Carly Persinger, and I am the Assistant Museum Curator for Portsmouth Museums, and I just wanted to welcome everyone to the first installment of our Black History Now 2026 lecture series. First, I would like to introduce Mayor Shannon Glover to give some opening remarks on Black history.
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you for everyone who is in attendance here today. When I woke up this morning, I knew this event was going to take place, and I wasn't really sure, but thank you for being here. Before we get on with the program, I'd just like to share a few observations. At this time in our country, I think it's critically important that we as a community understand and share our history. More so than what you hear on social media or see and the things that are involved, this time is really for our community to reflect on who we are and what we are and what we will continue to be as we go forward. The stories that you will hear, not just in Black History Month, but throughout the year, must be those stories of faith, of hope, of resilience, and telling our children and our children's children and reminding them that we didn't just show up here. That there was a lot of work, a lot of hope, and a lot of belief. When our ancestors were brought here, they were brought to a country that they did not know, and they were subjected to some of the most horrific actions by people that they did not know. And that's important, folks. Beyond all of the rhetoric and all of the stuff that you hear, if we don't know our story, we will not know what to protect. When you say the children are our future, well, one of the things I want you all to take away from this presentation today, this room should be full. And the reason it isn't full, because from my standpoint, we have left the responsibility to share our story and tell our story and require that those in our community know our story to someone else. So remember, if you want your story to be told, you better be the one telling it, and you had better be the one sharing it. Our community depends on it now more than ever, and this time, all of the upheaval and the chaos that we're seeing, remember, y'all, Grandma used to sit you down, Granddad used to sit you down, and it was those stories that gave you the faith and the hope for a brighter future. I'm excited. I'm excited this afternoon because we've got a native daughter that has come back home. And by the way, this young lady has my favorite sister's name, Brenda, so I really like that. Well, I'll say one of my favorite sisters because my sisters might be watching this. So Brenda, but when I met Dr. Stevenson this afternoon, when I walked in the door, the thing that struck me was just her energy. She said, "Hi, Mayor." And I said, "Hi." She said, "I'm Dr. Brenda Stevenson. I was born here in Portsmouth." And, I thank God that you came back to Portsmouth and you came back home. And I thank God that your parents, James William and Emma Gerald Stevenson, taught you the best values, taught you about being the best person, and taught you about excellence. And I'm looking forward to your comments and your presentation today. Thank you all again. Welcome. And I'll turn the event back over to the MC.
I'd like to give a special thank you again to Mayor Glover and Councilwoman Kitty Bryant for attending this event today. I also want to give a shout out to Police Chief Jenkins for helping us facilitate this talk here. Their support and backing has been instrumental to the success and growth of our Black History Now program throughout the years. A little background on Black History Now. This program was started in 2016 with the intention of highlighting the African American voices, stories, and histories that have defined Portsmouth and Hampton Roads, but have too often been neglected or underrepresented in classrooms, textbooks, or in popular media. We've been able to highlight these stories, scholars, and community members by expanding Black History Now. And instead of only celebrating Black history for 1 month, we celebrate it throughout the year with lectures, programs, and exhibits. And today I would like to welcome Dr. Brenda E. Stevenson, the inaugural Hillary Rodham Clinton Chair in Women's History at St. John's College, Oxford University, as well as the Nickel Family Endowed Chair in the Department of History and a Professor of African American Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. Dr. Stevenson is a Portsmouth native and a Manor High School graduate and a social historian whose work centers on gender, race, family, and social conflict in America and the Atlantic world from the colonial period through the late 20th century. Today, she will present her lecture, Pray, Fight, and Flight, The Enslaved Black Family and Resistance. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Brenda E. Stevenson.
Well, good afternoon to everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming today. It's an honor to be here, and I would just like to thank Dr. Hogan, Carly, everyone on the museum staff for having me here. This is one of the few talks I've given in Portsmouth or even in Virginia since I was valedictorian way back when. And so it's nice to be here. I am from Portsmouth, proud to be from Portsmouth. I want to begin by thanking God from whom all my blessings come. And I would like to also just thank my parents. Thank you for mentioning them by name. I appreciate it. You know, the people who work for you so hard and then they never get any kind of, recognition or anything. So I want to thank my mom, Emma Gerald Stevenson, and my father, James William Stevenson. I also have a few teachers from the Portsmouth Public School System that are probably no longer with us, but I just want to give their names because they were so instrumental in helping me as a young Black child in the public school system when I was growing up in Portsmouth. And so I'd like to thank Mrs. Lily Wilson, who was my 7th and 8th grade English teacher. I would like to thank Miss Trudy Pond, who was my 9th and 8th grade English teacher when I was at Craddock High School. And then I would like to thank Mrs. Waters, who was the head of the counseling center at Manor High School and helped me to get so many scholarships that I was able to go off to college. And then I would like to thank Miss Evelyn Wall, who was my English teacher at Manor High School. And so I want to give tribute to those people. They helped me all along the way and make sure that I had good skills to be able to go off to college, do well there. Went to University of Virginia, and then to go on to graduate school. I went to Yale for graduate school. So, and from Yale, I'd like to thank particularly my former advisor, John Blassingame, who was so keen in helping me to get my career established. So, thank you all. I want to thank the mayor for being here. I know he's a very busy person, he and his lovely spouse, for coming out on this, and all of you all for coming out on this very cold day. I don't remember growing up in Portsmouth when it was this cold, but at any rate, and I want to thank all of you all for coming because you could be doing something else. And I really appreciate it. And my last shout out is to my church that I was a member of, Ebenezer Baptist Church, when I grew up in Portsmouth. So thank you all very much. And my husband, who came from LA with me, Dr. James Combs, and his family members. Thank you. Okay, so, all right. So I want to start with this image, and this is an image of the Dismal Swamp. We all know that the Dismal Swamp, of course, is very close to Portsmouth. In fact, I grew up in Cavalier Manor, and it's on the edge of the Dismal Swamp, the northern edge of Dismal Swamp. And I love this image because it captures not only the beauty of the Virginia countryside, but also, and particularly, this family that's trying to escape And you can see them in the foreground here. All right. And if you look back up, you'll see the dogs coming towards them and then the people behind them, because these are the people who are chasing them, who are trying to drag them back into slavery. And so what we know about this part of the state, and also in North Carolina too, is that many people actually were able to escape enslavement by going into the Dismal Swamp and moving other places, but actually building small communities that we call maroon societies in this swamp area. And so whenever I talk about resistance, not just in Virginia or the American South or North America, but also in the Atlantic world, including the Caribbean and South America and other parts of Southern America, I like to show this image because we find maroon societies throughout this area. When I first started teaching slavery or about slavery so many years ago, students would always ask me, well, why didn't people fight back? Why did they allow themselves to be enslaved? And I have to tell them, from the very beginning, from the African continent on into the Atlantic world, people always fought back. And they always created places for themselves where they could express their freedom and where they could enjoy their freedom. And oftentimes these communities, whether or not you're looking at Brazil, whether or not you're looking at Mexico, Jamaica, Barbados, Virginia, North Carolina, were called maroon societies. So I like to start with that just as a context to the fact that enslaved people did always fight back. And they didn't always fight back in this way. All right? They didn't always push back in this way, but they did indeed always push back. So I'll begin now. The Revolutionary War, okay, we'll go back, I'll stay there. The Revolutionary War was drawing to a close, and the enslaved African known as Ben Maul, who was brought to Maryland in about 1730, was growing old. So old, in fact, that his captor had reduced Ben's workload dramatically and allowed him to live away from his closely watched and controlled prime workers. Ben had been a captive in Maryland for some 50 years, and even though he had been sold at least once, he had managed to marry and have at least one child and several grandchildren. His family had become culturally African American, but he was still the African who held himself aloof from Creolized blacks, or people who were culturally different, continued to practice the religion of his ancestors, and faithfully passed on many stories of his African life and culture to his American-born descendants. Ben's determination to maintain his indigenous African subjectivity was a legacy of resistance that lived on in his multicultural generational family, fueling both his son and grandson's freedom dreams. The American Revolution had been an important event in their lives, but their pursuit of freedom had been internalized long before the war between Britain and the 13 mainland colonies that rebelled against it came to be, and long after the new United States of America formed. Family was essential to a bondsperson's life, and resistance was crucial to their familiar endeavors. And I want to emphasize that because oftentimes when people think about enslaved people, they don't think about family connections. For a long time, historians would talk about there were no family connections. There was no cultural connection to Africa. We know that that is not correct now, but I still want to emphasize it just in case people are still mistaken. Family not only meant love, support, procreation, socialization, protection, and reverence. Its humanizing impulse also meant resistance. Resistance to dehumanization, ill treatment, emasculation, defeminization, infantilization, suppression of one's culture, destruction of one's family, and the undermining of family roles was a fundamental ethos located not only within the individual, but also within enslaved families and communities. Enslaved parents ignored the notion of illegal behavior imposed by their masters as they socialized their children through example. And this is what, you have a picture here I want to show you. This is a family groupings or family groupings located in slave quarters, a drawing that someone did. And I wanted to show this image because parents and were, did spend time with their children during their leisure time. They did talk to them, they did sing to them, they did tell them stories, they taught them about their faith, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's well captured in this particular image. And remember that the slave population was a young population from the very beginning. The people who were taken as enslaved people, as Dr. Hogan will tell us, since he studies African history, were young, usually not older than 30 years old, and most of them were males. But as time went past and through natural birth, the numbers of females and males became more equal in number. And also to remind you all that while this paper is not specifically on Virginia, because it comes out of my last book, which is on the American South versus just being on Virginia, that Virginia always had the largest slave population from the very beginning. And even though slavery grew to be about 4 million people by the time we get to the point of the American Civil War, Virginia always had the largest slave population. So it's always interesting to me when I go somewhere and people say, well, Virginia's not really in the South. Oh, no, dear. Virginia defines the South. All the things that you think about for the American South started in Virginia, okay? And so, including the institution of slavery, if we're looking at the British colonies at any rate. Okay, so enslaved parents ignore the notion of illegal behavior imposed by their masters as they socialize their children through example, oral stories, and instruction to resist oppression. The lessons began when youth witnessed their parents, older siblings, other kin, and members of the quarters find effective ways to avoid material deprivation and physical, sexual, and psychological abuse, while keeping as much of their interior lives and cultural expressions beyond the gaze of owners. So people often thought that people taught their children to be submissive. They didn't. They taught them to act like they were submissive, okay? To act as if they were submissive while they were quietly and privately resisted in order that they would continue to feel a sense of themselves and control for themselves. Beyond the gaze of owners, supervisors, and patrols, slave children learned to walk a fine line between maintaining one's humanity and agency while not annoying, angering, frightening, or disrespecting white authority figures, or at least not caught doing so. One of their first resistance lessons was to mask, that is, to hide as much as possible about themselves and others who were close to them. This invisibility was essential to their survival. As captive children grew into adolescents and adults, they learned how to recognize and factor in the consequences of rebellious or compliant behavior on themselves and their kin. Family ties often were at the root of an individual's defiance. It also forced, however, submission. Slaveholders understood that families were one of their most potent weapons they could use to control a bondsperson. Disobedience often led to brutal punishments, but also threats to the well-being of one's children, spouse, siblings, or parents. So people could, for example, become threatened with selling family members off if a person didn't obey, if a person didn't meet their work quotas, et cetera, et cetera. Enslaved adults realized that resistance occurred on a continuum that extended from the smallest act of personal rebellion to full-scale community-wide revolt. So too did white authority understand that a black refugee could become part of a maroon society, as we saw in the Dismal Swamp, for example, and how maroons might plot and sponsor rebellion and revolution. Again, Virginia is at the forefront of what we think about when we think about slavery in the American South. If we look at slave rebellion, everybody knows about Nat Turner. For example, there were other slave rebellions, of course, that took place in Virginia, in the state of Virginia, from the colonial period forward. As early as 1691, the colonial legislature of Virginia passed, quote, an act for suppressing outlying slaves. noting that many times, and I'm quoting here, Negroes, mulattoes, and other slaves unlawfully absent themselves from their masters' and mistresses' service and lie hid and lurk in obscure places, creating a life for themselves and families that their enslavers could neither control nor extract benefit. Again, talking about maroon societies. Okay. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about religion and resistance. Okay, this is just, I'm glad I came across this image because I showed you the first image of maroon societies in the Dismal Swamp, and this is another image of a maroon family in the Dismal Swamp. And one of the professors at William and Mary, and I can't remember his name right now, but he's done extensive archaeological work in the Dismal Swamp, and he has been able to actually find exactly where little villages of enslaved people who had run away had actually established themselves in villages, they have started growing crops, et cetera, et cetera. And what would happen is that there'd be raids from the militia, and there'd be raids or soldiers or the local policing forces, and people would scatter, but then they'd reconnect deeper into the swamp and start all over again. So here is an image of a family here, but again, you see in the background, these people are searching for them, if you can see, through the forest. So they're never secure in what they're doing because there are always forces that are out trying to secure them. So masters and mistresses routinely regarded the resistance efforts of enslaved people as indicative of their moral shortcomings, rather than as a rational response to slaveholder mistreatment and immorality. However, many bondspeople invested in belief systems that created a spiritual and cultural distance between themselves and their masters, and provided psychological support and resistance for them and their families, as well as noted here as for their families. So they're able to use their religious beliefs to help to protect their families, as well as to particularly to protect them psychologically. So the religions of the enslaved varied greatly. I want to just show this photograph. This is Yarrow Marmount. Okay, he was an Islamicized enslaved person from South Carolina. Well, we know that 1/3 of the people who came to the Americas as enslaved people were Islamic in faith. Okay, and this is an example of one. And in South Carolina, we have examples of people who came early on in the colonial period, stayed Islamicized throughout the colonial period, the early republic, and the antebellum period, and at the end of the Civil War, were still Islamic in faith. And he's an example of a person who was still Islamic in faith, and later into his life. Okay, so these religions vary greatly, with blended aspects of indigenous beliefs and rituals, Islamic, Protestant, and Catholic texts and practices. Examples of syncretic religious practices were flush in the Black Atlantic, including North America. Hoodoo and voodoo practice across the South drew on Yoruba rituals and beliefs and activities linked to the Mende peoples, Poro and San societies, the Congo. Of course, the first people who arrived in Hampton in 1619 were Bakongo peoples, people from Angola and the Congo region. They maintained some of their religious beliefs. And Muslims were evidenced in South Carolina, along with Igbo practices that were well documented on Sapelo and other low country sea islands. I have to give a shout out to the Igbo because I am a descendant of Igbo peoples, and my daughter-in-law is Igbo. Okay. Moreover, as religious historian Albert Rabateau noted, conjure was not just a way to explain, quote, evil, but also a way for, quote, root doctors to invoke harm as well as to remove it. This sentiment certainly was appealing to people who otherwise had very limited control of the good and bad in their lives and those of their loved ones. So religion functioned as a way to also instill resistance and also instill rebellious activity among enslaved people, but also to comfort people when they were unable to openly rebel. Parents and family elders passed on these practices through their own actions and oral traditions in the form of autobiographical tales, recitations of conjure ingredients, ghost and animal stories, dream interpretations, and song. Did any of you all grow up with these stories? Because I did. My mom's from South Carolina, so they were not playing. Okay. They were using everything available to them to survive. Okay. Consider, for example, some of the evidence of the practice of Islam or some syncretic forms of one. One Low Country woman, historian Sylviane Diouf, identifies as, quote, Old Lizzie Gray, explained of her religious belief that, quote, Christ built the first church in Mecca and his grave was there. So you can see the coming together of both religions when she's talking about Mecca and she's also talking about Jesus Christ at the same time. So this is a syncretic coming together of these different beliefs. Bilali Muhammad and his wife Phoebe, according to their children and grandchildren, made certain to pray with the sunrise and sunset, bowing to the sun 3 times, and then kneeling or mass to pray with their string of beads. Phoebe also wore a white veil from her head to her shoulders. So too did another Muslim woman named Daphne. Others remembered the African they called Old Israel, who wrapped his head in a white cloth and kept a hidden book, presumably a copy of the Quran, and that he brought out while kneeling on a mat and praying, also with the rising and setting of the sun. There was also Omar Ibn Said, an enslaved in North and South Carolina, a learned man of Islam from Futo Toro in Senegal, who could still quote and write in Arabic long passages of the Quran. Years after his capture and sale in 1807, he eventually came to know and practice Christianity, but never forgot his family or their faith and teachings, or the sheiks in his homeland. Recording his autobiography in the 1830s, he recalled that before capture at the age of 37, he studied Islam for several years, made several pilgrimages to Mecca, routinely fought quote-unquote infidels, prayed 5 times daily, and gave alms in gold, silver, seeds, cattle, sheep, goats, rice, wheat, and barley. So the importance of religion was part of a long family traditions derived from their African past and sustained through their enslavement. Bond's people embraced religious beliefs, practices, and public demonstrations as central to their identities and kin relations. As a fundamental cultural marker that could be experienced visually and orally, religious beliefs and practice styles were some of the most portable and therefore enduring of cultural attributes, and potentially revolutionary ideology to enslave people across the generations. African women and men could and did transfer the ideal that religion was a central component of one's identity with them from Western Central Africa to the mainland colonies during the era of the African slave trade. And then again along the roadways from the upper South to the lower South. Again, Virginia is important when we look at the domestic slave trade because more enslaved people from Virginia were moved to the lower South and Southwest than from any other state. And then as part of the domestic slave trade in humans. Others renewed these beliefs when they arrived as part of the illegal African slave trade in the decades before the Civil War, since the African slave trade was made illegal in 1808. So Charles Ball recalled that his grandfather, the Ben Mall that I opened with today, continued to practice his traditional religion and took great pains to explain it to Charles. And this is the way we see the culture being moved from one generation to the other. You know, grandparents to their children, those children to their children, et cetera, et cetera. He prayed daily and sometimes multiple times when his workload allowed him to do so. Rejecting Christianity, quote, as, quote, altogether false, Ben recalled a, quote, holy man who had received his religious tenets from the true God in heaven. preached it on earth, and recorded it in a book, a copy of which was kept in every family. So Ben continues to teach his grandson Charles about what life was like in Africa. And this also is a kind of form of resistance. That is, not to allow oneself to lose one's culture, the culture that comes when one was a freed person, for example, versus the kind of cultural attributes available to you when you were enslaved. All adherents had to express a deep, quote, love of country, charity, and social affection, avoid being cruel, remain sober, and be truthful. Ben's grandfather's faith also required, quote, tenderness to wives and children. And so again, Ben is teaching to his grandson the ways in which he should behave as an adult in the Black community that he's in. And in this way, he is providing him with an alternative view to life and behavior and sense of self than he would have received just as an enslaved person without such instruction. So the many children of Hannah and Kalina, both Igbos in the Low Country, likewise learned much about their parents' indigenous cultural lives from them, including religious rituals. Quote, they talk a lot of funny talk to each other, a past acquaintance notice, and quote, and they is mighty particularly about praying. They pray on the beads. So people are looking at them and talking about them and talking about the ways in which they practice their African traditions and not really understanding what they were doing, but understanding for them that was religion. For us, it was not religion. That is, they used beads for divination purposes. Others recalled participation in African-influenced harvest rituals, harvest rituals that included praying, singing all night, and with the sunrise, we go out and dance to big beating on the drums. And this image is an example of a yam festival that took place among the Igbo of Western Africa. And so these traditions in smaller versions and less elaborate versions, of course, were some of the traditions that are spoken of here for people who were enslaved with these people. One noted that they shouted and danced in a circle not only to drums, but also to rattles made from dried gourds with seeds in them, and to the beating of tin plates. Harvest Festival, they call it. Families and fictive kin took part in this annual communal religious practice, similar in description to Igbo yam festivals. So Christian missionaries and ministers of various denominations continued to have potent competition from deeply embedded African religious traditions that were sources of Black diasporic pride, belonging, and knowledge that enslavers could not manipulate for their own purposes. Many complained of the, quote, heathenistic rituals, superstition, and idolatry that bondspeople clung to despite their owners' efforts to rid them of this resource. So certainly by the time of the American Revolution, some enslaved people in North America had become Christian converts, at least outwardly, or in conjunction with the retention of their traditional African and Islamic practices. Colonial missions like that of the French Huguenot Francis Lejeune in South Carolina. And this is a picture of him. Francis Lejeune, who tried to establish Christian missionary sites in South Carolina, particularly among the enslaved people of South Carolina. South Carolina is an interesting place to study slavery because it's the only state where the majority of the people were indeed Black people. 60% of the population in South Carolina was Black. And we see large numbers of Black people in Virginia. Some counties had 60% or more, but many counties did not. But South Carolina overall in their population had 60%. Colonial Williamsburg, for example, 2/3 of the population on and off was Black. So we know that there were places, particularly in this part of the state, where there were large numbers of enslaved people. So anyway, he tried to teach them the catechism, rituals, and religious counsel for free and enslaved people. The Reverend centered much of his counsel on trying to get, and this is always funny to me, trying to get enslaved people to be monogamous, of course, because many people coming from Africa were polygamous and not monogamous. And can you imagine him trying to explain to somebody why you can only have one wife? And they're like, oh my God, here he goes again. And not to dance, feast, and have merry meetings on Sundays. And I have this image beside him because this is a famous painting of a dance that was taking place among enslaved people in enslaved quarters in South Carolina. And so you can see the people were getting down. And so, of course, dance is also ritualized. It's sometimes part of religious. I love the fact that, they have the banjo, for example, and the drum. The banjo, of course, is a West African instrument. You see the drum there as well. You see the people, there are couples that are formed, there are people who are dancing as well. And so I think it just gives you a sense of the kind of social lives that enslaved people had, even though we often just think about them as being brutalized, and of course that took place. But these people, like all people, were able to also find time and energy to enjoy themselves. And there's always one picture that I always show my students, and I'm gonna move away from the mic and show it to you here, because this brother is having a good time. And so, okay, this woman's talking to this man. This is brother going right here. And he's just sitting there like that. But I also like the fact that you see the head is wrapped. Often in Islamic society, you see the head wrapped with the white scarves like that too. But this man, it always cracks my classes up when I point that out to them. Caught in the act. And don't even care, okay? All right. Okay, so in the British colonies, and there was some benefit, of course, to being Christian outside of the faith itself. In the British colonies, being a Christian could also mean, quote unquote, benefit of clergy that could spare one the death penalty if you were found guilty for a crime, for example, and it was your first offense. If you were a Christian, you could escape the death penalty. Similarly, Catholic conversion in Maryland, as among the Spanish and the French, there were other places in North America at the time, allowed for some marital and familial protections. So too for those in the Dutch colonies who married in the Dutch Reformed Church, and we're talking about New York and New Jersey at that point. So, Christian adults, as those who adhered to their indigenous belief systems, passed on the benefits of their faith to their children and other kin. The formerly enslaved woman Elizabeth, for example, who was born in 1766 in Maryland, spoke of the lifelong imprint of her parents' religious faith and teachings. Both were Methodists, and her father, quote, read in the Bible aloud to his children every Sabbath morning, end of quote. Elizabeth felt deeply God's presence in her life from the age of 5. Once separated from her parents, because she was sold from them, her mother comforted her by reminding her that God always cared for her. Her parents' teachings of Christianity helped Elizabeth to reject her utter sense of hopelessness. Quote, I betook myself to prayer, she explained, and in every lonely place I found an altar. Parents and other guardians also routinely surveyed the behavior of the quote-unquote holy and clergy. They privately condemned those who behaved immorally, both to teach their children the differences between right and wrong, so that they could but also so they would be able to psychologically resist the moral authority errant, that is, immoral whites claimed. In the 18th century, cases of physically and sexually abusive ministers sometimes ended in public court cases that captured the imagination of the larger community. In 1771, a Virginia priest proved to be an excellent public example of white moral failure to both local and white and black people. He was found guilty of several offenses, including drunkenness, exposing his private parts, and soliciting, quote, Negro and other women to fornication and adultery with him, end of quote. Now, Bethany Veeney's mistress in the early 19th century told the young girl that, quote, every little child that told a lie would be cast into a lake of fire and brimstone and would burn there forever and ever. And these are two pictures of Bethany Veeney. One is a drawing, of course, when she's much younger and her autobiographical account is published. And one is a photograph of her when she's much older. This is after the end of slavery and all of that. So Bethany, she writes in her autobiography, quote, was dreadfully frightened and decided to take her concerns to her mother, who, despite her young mistress's claim to authority, still was the singular authority figure in Bethany's life. Bethany's mother told her that sinners would be punished, but, quote, those who told the truth and were good always would always have something they should want, everything they should want, end of quote. The promise resonated deeply with Bethany, helping to provide her with a spiritual and psychological wall against the hardships she faced while enslaved. Her mother's words of faith, she noted, quote, made a very strong impression upon me. I believed every word she said, and from that day to this, I have never doubted its truth, end of quote. Such lessons encouraged enslaved children to trust and obey the decisions of their kin rather than their enslavers, particularly at the time of resistance planning and implementation. Obedience and trust were essential if they were to be successful, regardless of if the plan was to escape, mount an armed revolt, create a maroon society, pilfer necessary food and clothing, murder or destroy property. Okay. Self-emancipators. No other form of documentation provides more insight regarding slave family resistance than enslaved escape notices and recapture advertisements published in the British, Spanish, Dutch, and French colonies in North America. And of course, this resonates with this history of people who escaped, resonates really well with the people of Portsmouth and Norfolk and in this area, because so many people escaped. Were able to escape from these areas. And of course, there's no notification in the city of Portsmouth for, the Underground Railroad sites at the Black Church, for example, and on the coast, the waterfront as well. So I think this resonates very well. This is an advertisement that you see that was placed in 1758 by Landon Carter, one of the Carter family members, about the escape from my house in Richmond County, where Warsaw, Virginia is, if you're not sure where that is, from the Middle Peninsula. From time in August last, a tawny young Negro fellow named Will, very likely, what does that mean? Very attractive and sensible for a slave. Okay. He lived for many years at Ripon Hall near Williamsburg and was removed on account of his ill behavior. It is proposed he went to Ripon and carried off with him a young Negro wench named Sarah, his sister, and that they are gone to the eastern shore with a fellow named Peter, belonging to one of the Lee family on York River, who had been indulged by his master to work abroad or to work away from the plantation. Whoever will secure the said Will and Sarah, so that they be delivered to me in Richmond County aforesaid, shall have 5 pounds cash besides what the law allows. Landon Carter. Okay. So this is just an example of the thousands of fugitive slave advertisements that you found in colonial newspapers throughout the American South and throughout North America in general. The thousands of recovery advertisements found in colonial and later newspapers, as well as the budding number of maroon societies in the swamps, mountains, and other physically isolated areas, document this very family-centered mode of resistance. So the largest numbers of people who escaped were males, but we can, 2/3 of them. But 1/3 of them were female, and oftentimes the females did take their children with them. Oftentimes the males took their wives with them, or their sisters, as you can see from this advertisement. So this is a family event. So many colonial era refugees were Africans. The people who first arrived had no ties whatsoever with people who were here in this country and decided to, of course, escape. Who did they escape with? Other Africans who spoke their same language, who had their same cultures, okay? Recently separated from their homelands and families. A court in Louisiana ordered that a quote-unquote bomber or slave man who had just arrived on the ship be whipped, quote, by the public executor because he repeatedly escaped and, when captured, had seized his master's gun. Surveys of enslaved people on the run in South Carolina between 1732 to 1782 indicate that about 2/3 of those persons who escaped were Africans. A similar account of fugitives from Georgia for the period 1763 to 1775 documented 3/4 were African born. Some of the accounts from these areas also indicate that when Africans escaped in groups, they often did so with persons of the same ethnicity, most probably their first fictive kin relations in the colonies. Quote, 2 lusty New Igbo Negro fellows in Georgia, for example, escaped together from their owner Joseph Gibbons in 1765. Quote, 2 Mandinga men and 1 from Guinea managed to get away from James Lawrence of Charleston, South Carolina in 1774. Some who had managed to marry and have children in the colonies escaped from them. In 1777, 3 African male and female couples, 5 individuals designated as being from the, quote, Guinea country, and 1 male from the Kisii country escaped together from their owner in Georgia. Enslaved men and women usually escaped in attempts to reunite with family from whom they had been separated, or to seek freedom as couples, families, and fictive kin groups. Refugees left on their own with a child, sibling, or spouse, few others from their quarters, and sometimes in larger groups. Barbary in South Carolina ran away with her young child who was not yet walking. Frances supposedly went to her husband, whom her master believed was, quote, harboring her. In Louisiana, Timber routinely escaped, quote, to sleep with a negress called Mariana, end of quote. Sylvia was believed to escape to her mother, whom recently had been sold. John Jones estimated that 2 of his fugitive men, 20-year-old country-born Joe and 18-year-old African-born Tom, who still had his country marks on his cheeks, returned after 6 months to get 10-year-old James. Some, like Tom, who had parents on George Washington's plantation and was still in that vicinity 1 year after his escape, lingered even longer near loved ones to try to take them to freedom or to seek their protection from slave catchers. Okay, so I just wanted to stop for a moment and show, as I said, these images which I got offline. One of them from the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Portsmouth that we know was the site of the Underground Railroad. And then also, what I thought was really interesting and had not seen before, I went looking for it, was this whipping post from Portsmouth, which was used as a way of punishing enslaved people who had escaped and done other sundry crimes, etc. And here is a picture supposedly of it, although I because of the soldiers' uniforms in the background, I don't really think it's from Virginia, probably from some other place in the Americas, but nonetheless the whipping post is very similar to the one that was in Portsmouth. And so Isaac and Isabel escaped with their child once they arrived from New York in Charleston, where they were to be sold. A group of 10 slaves, including a mother, Affie, and her 8-year-old son, Peter, escaped from a captive ship in Charleston Harbor that was carrying them from Baltimore to the Spanish Caribbean. And 9 persons left the Georgia plantation of James DeVoe in 1770, 3 men, 3 women, and 3 children. Sancho, Ward, Bella, and Phoebe, all from the same quarters in Virginia. And no doubt either friends, family, or both escaped together in April 1738. So it goes on, and of course we know that large numbers of enslaved people escaped from this area of Virginia during the American Revolution and also the War of 1812. Not only did refugee couples and family units abscond together, some imagined coupling within the context of their escape plans. Billy, a South Carolina bondsman, tried unsuccessfully to induce a black woman living on a nearby farm to go off with him. She said no. Okay. When she refused, he managed to convince another woman, he wasn't picky, from those quarters, Hannah, to do so, promising to bring a horse to help her with their escape. Quote, Hannah went out and was has never been since seen or heard from by her owner. Billy was later caught, but not Hannah. He was executed for aiding her escape. More than a few masters, realizing that men desired wives, purchased women as potential spouses for their bondsmen, hoping that doing so would prevent their prime male workers from leaving. James Sterling of Detroit, for example, purchased 2 black women in 1764 in order to induce his, quote, 2 big Negroes from absconding. Now, this is from Petersburg, Virginia. And so I'm going to end with this story. When the enslaved man Fortune and his wife Aminta, and this is the advertisement for their escape that you see up here on the screen, decided to flee the bustling market hamlet of Petersburg, Virginia, for freedom, they could not have anticipated the course of events that would punctuate their lives as fugitives in Philadelphia, which is where they went, in service to the loyalist cause only a few years later, the cause of the British during the American Revolution, and eventual freedom in the northern British province of Halifax, Nova Scotia, in Canada. Aminta and Fortune prepared for a free future, even though they knew that the odds were, as ever, stacked incredibly against them. Having recently been brought from Rhode Island, they had not put down any kin roots in Virginia. So this is a husband and wife who are coming from, who were sold from Rhode Island to Virginia. As a couple who would soon be parents themselves, she was pregnant. Perhaps a reason that they decided that they had no time to waste because they wanted their child to be born in freedom, they took to the open road or water, perhaps they escaped by water, as clandestine hunted fugitives. Aminta and Fortune dressed as would be expected of free people, not enslaved people. Indeed, the quality and quantity of their clothing that they had at their disposal indicates that even as bondspeople, they had been valued, perhaps skilled people. William Bradley, their new captor, or their master in Petersburg, seemed well aware of their unusually rich bundle of clothing, which he described in detail for the fugitive slave advertisement. You can see in here that he talks about all the kinds of clothing that they could be wearing, etc. And indeed, there was a lot more clothing than typically enslaved people will have: a red flannel petticoat, a dark calico gown, a blue and white one as well, an old light colored one too, a red cardinal and black bonnet, and several other things, etc., etc. And so he also describes what they looked like. They see that the man had buckskin breeches, a thick coat, a brown sailor's jacket, a red greatcoat or big coat, a fine hat, etc., etc. Stockings, so they had a lot of, clothing. It was quite unusual for enslaved people. So the 40-year-old Fortune had buckskin pants that were almost new, 2 heavy coats, a sailor's jacket, a large brimmed hat that he wore, and a cap for warmth, and maybe even a silk one. Regardless of his escape route, Fortune would not have appeared as a frightened enslaved man out of place with free people. He would have looked confident because of the way in which he dressed, and competent on his way to some place where he was expected. Amina, a 30-year-old mixed-race woman with, quote, the look of an Indian, and described in part from an indigenous person who had been brought from a Spanish colony. She wore her long black hair on her neck, also carried with her costumes of an elite domestic or freed woman, numerous items of dress, as I read out earlier, etc. The couple had claimed to be free. Now, it could have been that they were free and had been stolen and sold into slavery, which often happened. But anyway, they were able to get to Philadelphia, and they were able eventually to be able to move with the British loyalists up into Canada. Their daughter, Rose, was born in 1774 in Philadelphia, traveled with them and other refugees to British Nova Scotia. Despite the many difficulties that loyalist free blacks suffered, Rose Fortune, her father's quote-unquote slave name became the family surname in freedom, grew up, married, had children, at least 3, and she had a business. She began, okay, this is a picture of her. She began a baggage carriage business that gained her public recognition and some respect. Rose also became an unofficial policewoman, helping to keep Halifax safe for her community, and she did have a community. In fact, the Fortune family came to be close to another group who had dared to leave Virginia with the British for freedom, also eventually in Nova Scotia. In the 1830s, 2 of Rose's children, Jane and John, married siblings Isaac and Hester Godfrey. Now that was part of the Godfrey clan that came out of Norfolk that escaped during the American Revolution. It became part of the Ethiopian regiment as well. The Fortune family eventually even extended even more to include the connections that took place when Rose's daughter Margaret married John Francis. These 3 married couples gave Rose Fortune at least 8 grandchildren and a host of future descendants who today live in both Canada and the U.S. The family that Fortune and Anita could only have dreamed of when they escaped came to be and to thrive. Indeed, one of their descendants, Doreen Lewis, there she is, was the first black person to become a mayor, okay, in Canada. So enslaved family resistance not only mattered, but it also sometimes succeeded spectacularly. That's the end of my presentation today. Again, I want to thank all of you all for coming out today, and I want to thank the Museums of Portsmouth for having me. Dr. Hogan, thank you again. Thank you so much. Thank you for our mayor for being here today, and for staying, and for all of you people for coming out, again, in the cold, but to learn about our history and hopefully to understand. We've been through everything. We can survive everything because we have. Okay. Thank you all so very, very much. This way.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Stevenson, and we would like to thank everyone for coming out and attending our lecture today. Our next lecture in this series is going to take place in this room on February 21st. At 1:30 p.m., where Mr. Charles Johnson presents the African American Historical Society of Portsmouth, Preserving a Community's History.